Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Daily Creative Challenge. My name is Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe, and I hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon. We have made it through the week, and I'm excited for the weekend. If you are tuning in live here on Behance, let me know who you are and where you're tuning in from. We've got Laura and Kevin and Munir and Cody, Ariana and Anahit and Wade, Julia, Jack, Nikolai. Hey Nikolai, welcome. Chris, Megan, great to see everyone here. If you are tuning in, let me know who you are and where you're tuning in from. So, today's Masterclass number 27. We've made it through a lot of Masterclass. That means there's 27 hours of free Adobe XD content on the web, just for the Masterclasses. That's in addition to all the other content that we have currently and content that we are working on. So let me hop over to my screen. And this is what we are going to be putting together today. You may have seen me tweet this a little bit ago. It's also on Dribbble. I think I also post on Instagram. It's all over the place. And we're going to be creating this. So it's kind of like a runoff of what we were doing a few weeks ago with the Boop podcasting application. Now we're going to start polishing it up a little bit, and we're going to work on individual screens. You know, this specifically is more of like a music player or a podcasting player, some sort of a player, right? Aubrey from Cambridge, and we've got Brandon from Atlanta, Jay Swanson from Portland, Oregon. Great to see people from all over the place. I know we also have a lot of international folks tuning in. Many people from India and Bangladesh tune in during these master classes, and it's like 2 a.m. over there. So thank you for sticking around and staying up or waking up super early just to watch me. That's crazy, but I appreciate it. All right, so here we go. Let's hop over to Adobe XD. And boop, there we go. And I'm also going to show you, if you missed the announcement, we released a new update, Adobe XD 32, which comes with multiple flow supports, and I'll show you that in a little bit. All right, so we are here in Adobe XD, and we are going to get started. We're going to start off very simple, just with an artboard. So over here, I can go ahead and check out all the different mobile devices. In this section here, we've also got web, we have social devices or social posts over here as well. So if you're creating an Instagram story, a Twitter post, a Facebook post, you can do that as well. Megan says, that's one attractive pause button, isn't it? We're gonna get a little bit fancy today. So I'm gonna start, let's go for an iPhone 10R, 10S Max, 11, a lot of different numbers and letters in there, but we're gonna press on that. It's gonna launch in a second, there we go. And we are going to get started. So if you remember, just a moment ago, I showed you this. There's 2 different versions. There's a light version and there's a dark version. If we have time, we'll get to both. We may not, but we're gonna start with the light version because it's on the left. Why not, right? Boopski is back, indeed. I will get to a Boops shortly. So, on this artboard, we're going to start with our colors, and we started to define a few colors during the masterclass a few weeks ago. And one thing you're able to do is you're actually able to load in documents to use as a design system, for example. So if I hop over to my assets, and I can go ahead and press this linked assets button right here at the top, and this will allow me to browse my documents on my Creative Cloud account. So let's go ahead and find, where is the one I'm looking for? I think it's under UI kits. And I have this podcasting UI kit that I'm working on. I also have a UI kit for Adobe Max coming up, not too distant future, that I'm working on here. Should be fun. I can't click on it. It won't even open because it was done using an unreleased version of XD, so they won't even open. But I'm not going to click on it just in case it does open and you see something you shouldn't see. So I'm going to go ahead and load this, and automatically it loaded in all the colors, all the components. If I had any character styles, it would load in those as well. And these ones in particular are all linked to that document. So if someone is working on the document as the owner of a design system, they'll be able to share this document with you. You'll be able to load everything in, and if they do decide to update, let's say the primary yellow or the green or whatever it might be, you can very easily do that. Becca says, I have a Q&A in XD. Can we also make social media posts? Absolutely. Most of the posts I create or I upload to social media, this one in particular, was all done in XD. So you can absolutely do that. And with one of the newer versions of XD, let me bring this back over here. we now have a section dedicated to social posts, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. You can do a lot of different things on there. We also have a product called Adobe Spark, which helps you create things like that as well. You might want to check that out, and it's free, which is great. All right, so for this particular artboard, since we are starting off with the light version, I'm simply going to change the background to this lovely green highlight color. It's, if you notice, if I go back and then forth, it's very, very light. It's very, it's hard to tell from the white, but it's very subtle, right? And if I take a look at the color picker, it's basically white with a touch of green in it. It's kind of nice, right? And it's going to allow us to do some interesting things on this artboard as we're designing. So there are a few things that we might want. Did you hear that? Siri's talking to me. Weird. Siri's still talking to me. All right, so there's a few things we might want on this artboard. Maybe the ability to go back, for example, might be the first thing we might want to do. Very basic, right? It's a little bit of an arrow at the top left, because essentially this artboard is going to be, it's going to be a design of a music player. And you're probably not going to launch the application and this is going to be the first screen that you're on, right? So yeah, mint green, it almost kind of looks like mint. So maybe at the top here, maybe let's start by dragging out some guides. We'll put this one about 32 pixels from the left, and if I zoom in here, you can see what's going on. So if I hover my mouse on the left side of an artboard or the top of an artboard, I get this hidden area that you can simply drag out guides from, just like this. And this one I'm going to pop about 32 pixels as well. Perfect. All right. Now I also have, if you took a note over here, on the left-hand side in my assets panel, when I loaded in those assets, it also brought in some of the components. And this one in particular is the navigation bar. And I did show you all how to create this navigation bar a few masterclasses ago. So if you want to go through that, you can definitely do that. Boop, I'll just drag this on here and pop this into place. All right, and if I am the owner of the assets that I linked over, I can simply right click and edit main in source document. So it'll open up the document and I'll be able to edit it, which is great. All right, so up here, I'm gonna drag out a guide somewhere about 45 pixels from the top, only because I want to keep in mind that Kevin says, oh my God, the stream was starting this whole time, I had to refresh. Kevin, that sounds like you. So I dragged out a guide about 45 pixels from the top, only so that I can keep in mind that at the top of this particular iPhone, there's the lovely notch that we're all familiar with, right? And you don't want to put anything up there because it's going to get blocked and no one's going to be able to interact with it, right? Laura says, where can we find these icons? So these icons in particular, if I'm not mistaken, I grabbed from Nucleo. And they're not Nucleo's icons, but I do have an icon set loaded in called symbol icons. And if I search home, for example, I've got, yep, those icons here. They came from the symbol icons library, which I loaded into Nucleo. Nucleo is a free third-party icon manager. They do have their own icon set, which I believe is like $99 or something like that. I haven't purchased it yet, only because I have so many different icons from so many different sets. And if you don't have any paid icons, you can always go to the Icons for Design library or plugin and type in home, and they have a bunch of open source icons that you're able to use as well. All right, so continuing on, we've got our navigation bar, and like I mentioned, we might want some sort of a back icon to start off super simple. So I'm going to turn on my grid, Command and Control apostrophe, the little bloop at the top, and I'm going to grab my pen tool. I'm going to zoom on in here and just use that grid to create a nice arrow going backwards. And I can go ahead and click on these colors. I can right click and apply as border if I want to. So that's the darker green, and we've got our primary green. Probably primary looks pretty good. I can increase the size of the actual width of the border down here at the bottom right hand corner of my properties inspector. I can also round out the caps if I want to. Let me turn off the grid. I can round out the caps so we have nice rounded corners at the end. I can also go ahead and actually adjust this corner right over here with these options. So this one will round it off a little bit and this one will kind of chop it off. So I'll probably go with the rounded to keep consistency. All right, so I'm gonna pop this, make sure it's right about there where the grid is or the guides. Let's take a look. It looks okay, not bad. I'm gonna bump it up in weight just a little bit. Yeah, that looks okay. I'm gonna move it down just a touch. All right, so now maybe over to the right-hand side, keeping things simple, we might want some sort of a menu. Now, just to make sure everything's kind of aligning up, I'm gonna do it right beside this icon here, drag this out just like that. I'm gonna apply the same primary green, make it a little bit thicker, round out those caps. And then I just want a few more going down. There we go. Almost. There we go. Perfect. Okay. I'm going to make sure to group this. And I'm going to call this menu. Beautiful. And drag this over to the right. All right. That could work. We're going to run with that. So, now to start getting at some of the big things that are part of this particular design. Again, for anyone just joining, I think a few people just joined, we are going to be recreating this music player, podcast player, whatever you want to call it, using Adobe XD today. So back over here, first thing we want is the image at the top. So if I grab my ellipse tool right up here, I can go to the center of this particular artboard, hold down my Alt or Option key and Shift, and just drag this out, just like that. And now I have a placeholder that I can use for my particular image. And if this was a music player, you'd probably drag in some album artwork, but because this is focused on podcasting, I'm gonna hop over to Finder, whoop, there we go. And I've got some images here of great looking people. I can drag this one directly into this image and boop, there we go. And it pops it into place. I can also double click on it and move it around if I need to. And there we go. Al says, hello from Bangladesh. Hello. Anna from Berlin. Great to see everyone from all over the world. All right. So we've got this circle right at the top. And we want to use this kind of as the progress indicator of how much the podcast we have listened to. But we want to get a little bit fancy with it, right? So there's a few things we're going to do. The first thing, I want to create some sort of a crevice almost. So this particular image is going to kind of sit at the top. There's going to be a thing in the background that kind of looks like it has a bit of depth. And then we're going to add a little bit of a neumorphism style thing. And we're going to talk about neumorphism because I don't love it. But in certain situations, you can probably get away with it if it's not distracting you and causing accessibility issues, right? All right, so what I'm going to do is Drew is saying, do you usually design with target areas in mind for interactive elements? If I'm designing for developers or actual clients, then absolutely. But if I'm doing things like this, it usually skips over my mind. And what Drew is talking about is things like this, for example, right? You've got this little arrow, which I'm going to name, and it's this very tiny little arrow. If you take a look at the properties inspector, it's 8 pixels by 16 pixels. It's not ideal, especially if you're working with small mobile devices. If I were to go ahead and play this, it's a tiny little arrow at the top. So it's going to be very difficult, as is, to actually tap on. So what you would want to do in a target area, which Drew is talking about, is essentially add an invisible area behind it that will allow you and your users who are testing this application to get to it. So I would just grab a rectangle, for example, and hold down my Shift key and drag one out like this. And ideally, according to guidelines and best practices, you want it somewhere around, let's say 40 to 45 pixels. So I'm going to do 45 just to be on the safe side, and I'm going to position it somewhere right behind this particular arrow. And because we don't need to see it, we can just grab the opacity and whoop, drag it down. And I'll make sure to pop it into a group with this arrow, right? So now you can't see it, right? But when you actually wire this up to go back to another artboard or to some other element, right, even if it's a component and a state, that target area is much larger. So if someone has larger fingers or they can't get that little arrow properly, they'll be able to just tap in that general area and they'll be able to interact with it. Now, of course, depending on the element and if there are other things around it, you may want to adjust the size of that target area, but that's essentially what Drew was talking about. All right. So Andre says, I have a very long artboard. How do I export only what is necessary without the scroll area? So I don't believe you can. I think when you export an entire artboard, it just exports the entire thing. But what I would probably do is take all the elements that you want exported, put them into a single group, and then within the properties inspect or within the layers panel, right click on it, and then export selected. So you only export the group containing the elements of that artboard that you want to export. So hopefully that helps. All right, so going back to this, what I'm going to do is I do have this image here. I'm going to duplicate it, Command and Control D, and I'm going to make it a little bit larger, just a little bit. I'm going to move it behind. And just so we can see the difference, I'm going to just change the color to black for now. And again, this area is going to almost act as a little bit of depth. So it almost looks like, this image is on top of this area that kind of goes into the application. Sounds a bit strange and very crazy, but hopefully it'll all make sense. All right, so what I'm going to do is for this, just to give really the feel that there's depth, I'm going to change this to a linear gradient from top to bottom. And the top color, we're going to actually sample this background color and just kind of darken it up here, right? Just a little bit. The top color is going to be a little bit lighter. And then the bottom color, what I can do is I can sample this color that we just created and just drop it down a little bit, right? Somewhere right about there. So now we're starting to get a little bit of depth going on this design. It's not there yet, but it's getting there. Another thing we can do is add a little bit of a border around it. So I'm going to add a border on the outside, which is this icon right down here at the bottom. Boop. I'm going to change the border color to white and then just drop the opacity just so it's very subtle. This will add a little bit of almost like a bevel around, or like a lip around this particular area. I can do the same thing with this image as well. So I can add a bit of a border, basically the exact same process, and just drop the opacity so it's very subtle. That could work, maybe, we'll see. All right, so we've got a little bit of depth going on, but we're not there yet. Now, if you remember, over here, we have this kind of outline right around here. It's basically a gradient, right? And it almost looks like this whole area is kind of popping out from this application. And to do that, very simple actually. We're gonna grab this element that we just created, which I'm gonna I'll just call it whole, why not? And I'm gonna duplicate this, Command and Control D, and I'm going to make it larger, like this. And let's go ahead and name this, what do we name this? Depth, maybe? There we go. And for this one, we want a little bit of a different linear gradient, right? The top color is actually going to be almost pure white. Actually, it will be pure white. And the bottom color is, I'm going to go ahead and sample this background color because we want to basically play off of that background color as much as possible. And then drop this down a little bit, like that. Now already, without even doing anything more, we're already starting to see a little bit of depth on this. It almost looks like, they've got this area in the background that's popping out from this application, and you have this lovely image at the top that's kind of just sitting there, right? So it's looking pretty good. I might also want to increase the size of this border a little bit, just to give a little bit more lip, right? And now you can kind of see right in there, we've got this nice edge going on, right? Now, of course, depending on the style of your application, you may want to leave it at this, or you may want to blur this particular element a little bit to give a little bit more depth to it and make it feel a little bit softer. So down here at the bottom of your properties inspector, you've got your background blur, but you've got this arrow. So if you press on the arrow, you can change this from a background blur to an object blur. Boop. Now, object blur is set at 5, which really blurs the heck out of this in this particular case. Sometimes 5 probably won't do much, but in this case, it blurs it quite a bit. I'm going to drop it back to about 3, something like that, right? Now, if we take a look at it now, we have essentially the same effect, but it's a little bit softer. And I can go ahead and play around with this a little bit, make it a little bit larger. And you're probably noticing that when I turn off the object blur, this edge at the bottom looks a little bit more defined. It almost looks like it has more depth than it does when the object blur is on. So in that case, you may want to tweak these colors a little bit. Now the top color, it's pure white. You can't do much with that, so I'm going to keep it at pure white. But the bottom color, I may just want to bring it back just a little bit. Maybe add a little bit of color in there and just tweak that a touch. And what I can also do is also just kind of move this around a little bit. Maybe have it diagonal, right? When you're saying Howard is a shadow and gradient master. I spend a lot of time on my shadows and my gradients because they have to be done correctly. Otherwise, it just looks terrible, right? And there we go. That's looking pretty fancy. It's very soft. Now, let's talk a little bit about neumorphism, because I know a lot of people are looking at this and saying, well, that's kind of that neumorphism trend, isn't it? And Don't you hate it? And for the most part, I do hate it, especially the trends that are going around on like Dribbble and Behance that, use new morphism for text or buttons and that sort of thing. The reason I'm mostly avoiding new morphism is because it often causes accessibility issues. If I were to, for example, create a button that people need to see and use the same style here, something like this, right? This is going to be very difficult to see against a light background. First of all, it's ugly, but second of all, it's going to be very difficult to see. And considering people will need to directly interact with this particular button or text or whatever it might be, that's going to cause accessibility issues. If you're talking about something like this little bit of depth in the background, users will not have to directly interact with this, right? They'll have to see this image and it's bright and it definitely passes accessibility because it's a very bright, vibrant image. But this is basically just a little bit of fun design that I'm just throwing in there just because, right? So in that case, when you're adding things like that, it's probably okay. But if it has to be interacted with by users, probably want to avoid it. All right. So we've got this looking pretty good. I want to make sure in my layers panel, I'm going to name this profile, and I want to just grab all of these elements. I'm just going to pop them into a group. I'm going to call this progress. All right, so we've got that looking pretty good. And now, like I mentioned earlier, we may want to use this area to show how much of the podcast has been listened to. And there are a few ways we can do this. Of course, we could, we can add it up here, which we're going to do. We can also have an area down here that has a scrubber, which I think we created last time as well. But let's have a little bit of fun. So inside of this group, I'm going to let's grab this element here. I'm going to duplicate. I'm going to make it a little bit larger, but we don't want this whole thing to be filled in. I'm going to call this progress. Kevin is saying, is there a plugin for XD for accessibility? Yes. So the Stark plugin created by Kat Noon and her fantastic team, I probably have it installed here, and there it is. So Stark, if you're unfamiliar, basically will look at accessibility issues. So if I have, let's say, a button, let me get out of this group. I've got a lovely button over here, and I have some text. Hello, right? I'm going to purposely break all accessibility rules by doing that. So I'm going to go ahead and select both of these text layers, activate Stark. You have colorblind simulation, you have contrast simulation. I'm going to go ahead and press that, and it's letting me know. It's looking at both of those layers, and it's letting me know that gray text layer at the top and that white do not pass anything. Nothing at all, right? It's telling me normal text, large text, you're just failing everything. So if I were to change this to black, for example, and run this again, all of a sudden we're passing, right? Because there's a nice amount of contrast. So if you're doing something, let's say, let's go with some of our colors, right? So we've got our primary, or let's go for a yellow. So we've got the black and yellow. We go to our plugins, Stark, and this one passes too. Black on yellow. Now I see a lot of people do white on yellow. Sometimes I do it as well, but what you're going to notice with this, if I'm thinking about this correctly, it doesn't pass because that white can be a little bit difficult to see, or very difficult depending on who you are, against that yellow background. So if you're going with a yellow like this, typically you'll probably want to go black. All right, so here we go. Back to this. So we've got this extra element that we created, but we don't want the entire thing filled in. So I'm going to instead turn off the fill and just use a border, and I can apply one of our colors, let's say our secondary green, possibly. We might go back to the primary green, but we can apply that as a border, just like that. I'm going to make it quite a bit thicker, because this is going to be the progress bar. Maybe the primary green. We'll see. Now for this one, we only want part of this particular line filled in. So what you can do is you can play around with your dashes and your gaps within the Properties Inspector. So I'm going to go ahead and just crank this up a little bit. Now there is a mathematical formula that can help you, but honestly, you can just do that. Just kind of eyeball it, and then you can play around with the gap. There we go. You can round out the corners a little bit, or the caps, I should say. And now you have this sort of like a progress indicator going around this particular area. If I take a look at the preview, there we go. But of course, we might want some sort of a scrubber to go on top of this. So for that, let's zoom in on here. I'm going to grab my ellipse, shortcut key E, drag one out like this. We want it nice and large, and this kind of goes back to what Drew was talking about earlier, is adding a target spot. So in addition to this, you may want to add a larger area behind it, because honestly, if I do 45 pixels for this particular scrubber, that's a big scrubber, right? So you may want a smaller scrubber, a visual scrubber, and then a larger target area behind it. So keep that in mind. All right, so for this one, we may want to go with our primary green again. Maybe even we might want to go for a little bit of a green gradient. That could be fun, possibly. We'll see. And then for the border, we could do pure white, or what we could also do to kind of blend everything in nicely and elegantly is sample one of the colors back here. That might be a bit too much, but we might grab that and maybe bring it up just a little bit. So it's not pure white, but it adds a little bit of that green in there. It's kind of nice. And then to pop that from the background and all the elements behind it, we may want to turn on shadow. And shadows, I talk a lot about. Very, very subtle. So blur it a little bit. Now, because this is a very small element, you don't have to blur it too much, because if you blur it way too much, the shadows kind of just disappear and just blend in too much with everything else. So just blur it a little bit and then drop the opacity quite a bit. You can even, in this case, possibly add in a little bit of green back there. Did you see the difference? So there's black and there's green. Very subtle, right? And just play around with that opacity. All right. Let's see what that looks like. It's looking okay, but I would definitely, without even checking, I would definitely say we're going to probably run into some contrast and accessibility issues, especially in this area here, right? Probably want to avoid that. So there's a few things we can do here. One, I might want to just bring this in a little bit, and that will allow me to bring in the scrubber a touch. I'm going to make this a little bit larger as well, so that it kind of overlaps with that area, so there's a little bit more contrast over there, just like that. I can also increase the size of this a little bit. There's a few things that I can do to kind of get it working. And if I really needed to, I can bump up the shadow a touch more. Let's see what that looks like. That's looking okay. I would probably continue to tweak this a touch, but I do want to move on to a few other things. So we are going to do that. Let me actually just bring this in a little bit, just so I can reveal a little bit more of that depth behind it. And maybe I can even add a shadow behind here. More shadows, right? Everything has shadows these days. Aha, there we go. That's looking pretty good. It's not bad. It's not great. I can also move this out here, and let's play around with this a little bit. Bring this out a little bit. I don't know. I'll probably end up tweaking that. What do you all think in the chat? Let me know, and maybe I'll make some tweaks a little bit later on. But I do want to get to some more areas down here at the bottom. So this area down here is going to explain maybe who this person is that is being interviewed, a little bit more information. Then, of course, we want some icons to play or pause this particular podcast, go forward and back, add comments, maybe download to your computer, for example. So down here is where all that's going to live. So for that, I'm going to grab the text tool over to the left, shortcut key T, and let's start with, we're going to have two different text layers up here. The first one, it's going to just say interviewing. Looks like I had my caps lock on. Now, going back to the whole discussion about accessibility, obviously I wasn't going to leave it at white, but this is kind of why accessibility is so important. You take a look at this, and it's very difficult to read. And even though I can read it, and probably many of you can read this particular text down here, a lot of people can't at all. So you want to pay attention to that. So in this case, I'm going to use my secondary green right over here within my assets, and I'm going to choose the Josephine Sans typeface, or Josephine, still don't know how to pronounce it properly, but it's a newer typeface I've been using. It just looks really elegant. It's really fun. And I'll go for, let's say, a semi-bold, maybe even a bold, possibly, or maybe semi-bold. I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of time just going back and forth between different font weights and typefaces just to make sure I get the exact one that I'm looking for. Semi-bold, possibly. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I'll bring these in a little bit. There we go. And I'm going to make sure to center it on my document. Beautiful. All right. And if anyone is in the chat, let me know what your favorite current typeface is. Many of you have seen me use Sophia Pro, Poppins, Babus New, and this has been probably one of my newest favorite typefaces, Josephine, Josephine, I don't know how to pronounce it properly, but it's one of those. So we've got that there, and I'm going to duplicate this down, and this is going to be where the person's name is. So it might be Mary Ellis. Now, just to get a bit fancy with this one, I'm going to change the color. And for this, I might want to drop the weight of her first name to maybe regular. Oh, can you please move to the left side of the screen? Yes, I can probably do that. I'll just kind of move myself over here so you can all see what's going on. There we go. Hopefully that's a bit better. All right, that one, and I'm going to go to, let's go for bold. All right, Papyrus. Oh gosh, got 2 Papyruses already. George is saying, if you import assets from Illustrator, will it retain its editability? Absolutely. So let's see, do I have any? I probably have a ton of Illustrator files in my stock folder. Let's see. Actually, I have one here that I was using not too long ago. So here I have an Illustrator file that I grabbed from Adobe stock. And if I go ahead and grab this and drag it directly into Adobe XD, or you can also bring it in through Creative Cloud libraries, a lot of different ways you can bring in Illustrator files. But this is a regular old Illustrator file. It's a fairly basic one, but you can definitely get crazy with it. And you're going to notice as I dive into the groups, all the paths are there. They're all colored, they're all labeled, and you have a good time, right? So you can definitely edit your Illustrator files directly in Adobe XD. You can also copy and paste from Illustrator and Photoshop. A lot of cool things you can do. Sophia Pro and San Francisco. We've got Gibson, Nexa, Faro, Source Sans, Comic Sans, Joe. Rubik. Yeah, nice. All right, so back to this. We've got Mary Ellis. We've got her name going on. We've got interviewing right here at the top, and that's looking pretty good. Okay. I would probably make a few tweaks, but it's looking okay. Now, down below here, we may want a little bit of a description of this particular podcast. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab my text tool one more time, drag one out across here, and here I can start typing in, right? Now, obviously, that's way too big. Probably don't want a description that large. George is saying, so you can also do the bevel blur in Illustrator instead of XD. So it depends on what feature in Illustrator you use. As long as the feature is present, like object blur in XD, certain blurs will come over properly. Same thing with Photoshop. If you use intense filters in Photoshop, those will not come over because XD doesn't have support for that. So most things from Illustrator will come over properly. There are a few things that will not. All right, Drew says, go all in on neumorphism, include a track for the scrubber handle to move along. Interesting. So like an embedded area here, possibly. That could be interesting. But then we're kind of getting into the realm of that's an area that users will have to interact with. How far do we want to go to kind of pull away from accessibility? We probably don't want to go that far, but there could be something there we can do. It's an interesting thought, and I may explore that a little bit later. Julia says, I have a quick question. How can I export an SVG from Illustrator to import, or XD to import in Illustrator? So for example, if I wanted to export, let's say I had maybe this menu up at the top, I can go ahead and right click, go to export selected. And don't know if there was any like secret files in there, but you go to export selected, then you can choose SVG from the area at the bottom, and you'll be able to export that directly as an SVG, or you can just copy and paste. I believe that comes over as vector. So copy from XD, open Illustrator, paste it, should be good to go. All right, so we've got our description. Now for this one, I'm probably just going to go with a simple darker color, and then I'm gonna really drop the size, 24 possibly, maybe even like 16 might be too small. Possibly, we'll see. Semi-bold, we could probably stick with the Josephine Sans typeface. Could work. You're halfway to Winamp skins. Oh, I remember Winamp skins, those were amazing. So let's go ahead and just type something out. There we go, Howard sits down with Mary. There we go. So yeah, it does look a little bit small, so I'm gonna bump it up. Let's try 18. Let's see what that looks like. That looks okay. I think that could work. I'm gonna double click on this handle at the bottom just to kind of bring it on up and move it down a little bit. Let's say 24 pixels. Perfect. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now down here, we may want to start adding in some additional controls. And the main one, as you saw, and Vipin's asking, what are we designing today? We are designing this. This is a music player or podcast player application design in XD. So we're going to start now working on the actual pause button at the bottom. Aubrey is saying, how do you switch from text to selector so quickly? I do escape sometimes. So if I have the text like this, I can just press Command and Control Return, and that'll accept it. And then if I just press V, I should be able to switch to any different tools if I need to. All right, so down here, I'm going to grab my ellipse, draw one out. Again, I'm holding down my Alt-Option key and Shift to constrain it. There we go. Pop that right about, that might be a bit too big, but I'm going to shrink it down just a touch. Now for this one, we may want to explore a few different colors. So we have our primary green, right? Looks okay. We have our secondary green, not bad. We also have our gradient. I think the gradient can work, right? I think it looks pretty nice. And we will add a little bit of a bevel around it, very similar to what we did up at the top. And in that case, because this particular button is so prominent and would probably pass mostly accessibility, we can get away with adding a little bit of a bevel that blends into the background back there. But if that whole thing was just the button, and I'm going to show you that in a second. Actually, I can do it right now, actually. So going back to what I was talking about, we've got our depth layer here. And if I go ahead and paste the appearance on this, you know, a lot of people are doing this with neumorphism. They're doing things like this where it's like, let me actually backtrack for a second. Let me go ahead and create the actual button just so we can really see an example of what you probably should avoid doing. Put this in the middle. Here we go. We've got 18. Okay, that's good enough. They're a little bit too thick, so I'm going to just 1, 2. That's good. 1, 2. Perfect. Move this in the middle. Perfect. Okay. So going back to this, a lot of people are doing something like this. They're pasting the appearance, or they're creating some sort of button that looks like this. And it's like they're trying to make the entire button look like it's coming out of the application, right? And in this case, that's very bad for accessibility. Incredibly bad. Because a lot of people, let's avoid this for a second. A lot of people would not be able to see this button down here. I can see it, many of you can see it, a lot of people cannot because they have visual impairments of some sort, right? So that in particular, very bad. So we're gonna go back to this, but if we were to want to add a little bit of depth to this, because this button here is very bright, there's a nice amount of contrast between this button and the background, we can go ahead right now and paste and just add it in the background like this. So in the case that someone is not able to see this particular element back here, which I'm going to probably just drop the object blur a little bit, they can still see this green button in the foreground because there's a nice amount of contrast, right? So we can get away with that. Now let's also add, very similar to what we did at the top, some sort of like a little depth area or a hole or whatever you want to call it, right? So I'm going to duplicate this, move it back a little bit, make this a little bit larger, and let's play around with these colors. Ooh, there we go. That's looking pretty good. Drop this a touch. Aha, all of a sudden we have got this little, almost like a crevice going on. Right? I can add a little bit of a border around it to add a little bit of a lip. Want to make sure it's on the outside, so it's nice and subtle. I can also add a very subtle border, possibly. This might be a bit too much. It's not bad, but it might be a bit too much, right? Another thing you can possibly do is add a border on the bottom. So you add a shadow change that to white, set the blur to 0 and the Y value to 1, and just drop the opacity. Now this might be a much smaller area, but yeah, it's probably not going to work in this. If we're working with a much larger area, it can definitely work. Now for this one, because it is a smaller area, I may want to tweak the actual depth layer a little bit. So we have some questions. Let's see. Do you use some sort of plugin for accessibility, Stark or something? Yes, I just showed Stark probably about 10-15 minutes ago. Love that plugin. It's fantastic. I definitely recommend it. What kind of book do you read to know more about people interacting? I haven't read a design-related book in quite a while, so if anyone in the chat does have recommendations, throw that in there. What do you think while creating designs? I don't think about much, actually. I spend a lot of time looking at inspiration, Behance and Dribbble, but I don't think much. A lot of it's in the back of my head. It's just it's on autopilot. All right, so this one I might want to tweak a little bit. So I'm going to drop the blur to, let's say, 1. Maybe bring this in a touch. And then maybe just tweak the actual gradient a little bit. Maybe add a little, I don't know. I just want it very subtle, right? That's not bad. I think that could work. One thing you can also do is if you want to add a little bit more depth, almost like there's a light source, you can also add a shadow. So if I have a shadow down here at the bottom, I'm going to pull it away like this. Maybe pull it to the side a little bit and just kind of play around with this. Probably not ideal, but if you did want to add a little bit more of a shadow, you can kind of do that. That looks terrible, but you can do that, right? Subtle, right? All right. So we've got our pause button looking pretty good. I'm going to make sure to group all this, name this pause. Pop that right about there. And we may want some additional icons over to the left and the right. Particular, the two on either side is going to be the ability to go back and go forward. And these ones are actually pretty simple to create. Now these ones in particular, we are not going to add any sort of bevel, no shadows, no nothing, because these are going to be small and you don't want to add anything to that because then it just looks terrible, causes accessibility issues, a lot of different things, right? So I'm going to, one more thing you might not want to do is I have seen a lot of people add some sort of depth to the actual elements on an icon. You could go ahead and do something like, or a lot of people go do something like this. So they'll select a color like this, they'll make it a little bit darker, then they'll add some like inner shadows and things like that. Probably want to avoid that. You want this to have a nice amount of contrast with the green in the background. Keep that in mind. All right, so for this one, we're going to grab our polygon like that. I'm going to go ahead and rotate it a little bit. Maybe I'll round out the corners of this polygon just a touch. 2, 3 might be a little bit too much. So we'll do that. And for the color, we're going to use our secondary green. And then I'm going to use, let's grab a rectangle. Round out those corners, secondary green. And now we have a little bit of a button that will allow us to progress forwards or backwards. Now in this case, this is the one that will allow you to go forwards. And then what we can do is we can very easily just swap the position to go backwards, right? Or just flip it around. It's a bit small, so I'm going to just make sure, grow it a little bit, enlarge it. There we go. I'm going to group these. I'm going to call this forwards. And then drag this over, and I'm going to go ahead and flip it just like that and call this backwards. Perfect. All right. So we've got those icons looking pretty good. Now the other icons, because we're running out of time, I'm not going to create manually, but I can go to the Icons for Design plugin. Let's look up chat, for example. Got some good ones here. I can also go to my Nucleo application. And let's find one. Which one? This one looks pretty good. I'm going to drag this directly into XD. And we also might want one for downloading, so they can download this podcast directly onto their device. And this one looks pretty good. pop that right in there. All right. Should the pause button also have rounded edge like forward and reverse? So, oh, I see what you mean. You're probably talking about this. Yeah, we can possibly do that. Let's say 8 pixels. It's a good idea. Very good idea. This is why I love designing live. Very smart people who notice things that I completely missed. There we go. There we go. And bam. Looking pretty good. I'd probably adjust the spacing a little bit and possibly the size. And of course, going back to what Drew was talking about earlier, add target spots behind these so that people can very easily grab them and push them and all that fun stuff. But things are looking pretty good. I'm kind of liking how this is looking. I might want to make a few tweaks on this, make this a little bit larger, something to that extent. Maybe tweak this little hole color a little bit. Maybe so it's not so dark. I don't know. I think it could work. Maybe I'll just leave it like that. I don't want it super deep. There we go. All right. So the last thing I want to do is we have this design looking pretty good, right? Kind of happy with it. But we now want to be able to offer up a different version of it, different style. Maybe we want a darker version, dark mode. We all like dark mode, right? So I'm going to duplicate this over. Now, the thing you probably will not be able to do when transitioning from a light version to a dark version is simply grab the background and darken it. Because as you're seeing here, it's just an absolute mess. So you're going to really want to go in and make individual tweaks to every single element to get it the way you want it. I'm going to go ahead and hop over to Finder. We're going to bring in a different image. And let's bring in our good friend with the beard. Always use this guy. And this will allow us to use that primary yellow that we have in our design system. There we go. And we can start applying that to certain elements within this particular design. So this one, interviewing, might just be white. And this one down here, we might want to go for our primary yellow. Let's go ahead and type out his name. That's a little bit too large, so I'm going to just shrink it down just a touch. There we go. This might be white. Now this up here needs a lot of work, right? Cue the request for dark XD dark mode. One day, Drew, one day we will get dark mode in XD. All right, so these ones up here, we might just want to go for, there we go. Now this we need to do a lot, right? So the first thing we want to do is the hole in the background. I'm going to keep it very simple, actually. I'm just going to change it to a solid color and just drop it. Just like that, right? Now this area here, this depth, we need to do a lot. So this, I'm going to actually just, the light color, I'm going to drop it somewhere right about here. And this one I'm going to drop quite a bit because the background of this particular application is not pure black. And I did that on purpose, not only for aesthetic reasons, but so that we can go ahead and add elements like this little bit of depth. Because you want it a little bit darker than the background, just a touch darker, right? And you can play around with this one as well, just so it's nice and subtle. And then this border here, we want to drop a little bit. And the hole, we want to drop that color a touch as well. It's a lot of tweaking, right? Now this progress bar, we're going to actually bring in our yellow again. So I'm going to right click, apply as border. We're going to do the same thing for this one. Maybe we'll apply the gradient. And then for the outline, maybe we'll just go for maybe a darker color with a little bit of color in there. And I can bump up the shadow a touch. There we go. All right. We're starting to get there. So with just a little bit of tweaking, right, you can transform this into a dark version of your application. Let's bring this in a little bit. There we go. So now, also depending on the style and the design system and all that sort of thing, you can also tweak the actual positioning and scaling of certain elements. So in this version here, because I have this progress bar, because it's so close in color to some of these elements over here, I probably would not be able to get away with something like this, because it's going to blend too much with that hole in the background. But for something like this, I can get away with it, right? I can bring it in to kind of match the lip that goes around this particular area, because it doesn't clash with this in the background. So I could maybe possibly tweak this color a little bit to make it a little bit darker so that there is a bit of contrast. Then it gets a little bit too much. So I'm just going to actually just leave it as that. All right, now down here we want to make a few tweaks as well. We're going to change this to our gradient. And we are going to, let me grab the style here. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to grab this. I'm going to paste it. Now, of course, I do want to make a few tweaks to it, so I'm going to bump this back down to 1. All right, now the border over here is a little bit too much, so I'm going to bring that down. Let's change this to a darker color. And going back to what we were talking about earlier about white on yellow, it probably would not pass accessibility. So in this case, we'll want to change these over to a darker color. I can just sample the background if I wanted to, and there we go. Or I can just bring it up just a little bit, just like that. Now these ones here, we're probably just going to stick with a nice solid white. And then finally down to the bottom, just to add a little bit of a difference between the light version and the dark version, I may want to actually override this particular navigation bar. Maybe I'll just have a little bit of a darker color, or maybe a little slightly lighter possibly. And then all these icons, I'm just going to change to solid white. And there we go. So look at the difference. So we have the light version, which has a little bit of green in it. It has some depth. There's some dark green, there's some light greens, and then we have the dark version. Same design, basically, right? Someone saying maybe the hamburger icon is on the wrong side. It's, well, so here's the thing with that. In this case, it's probably gonna work, right? Because if I were to move the hamburger icon on the left side, the big question is, where do I put this? Right? This is the arrow to go back to the previous screen. And typically when you click on a screen, let's say you're on this screen here and you click on an icon to go to this screen, it's kind of slides over, or the natural reaction is to go back that way. Is that the right way, or is it that way on this screen? Yeah, that way, right? That's the natural reaction. So you'll probably want the arrow on this side. So in this case, the hamburger menu probably makes sense on this side. Now, if you're on the home screen, for example, the hamburger menu might make sense on the left, but you have to think about consistency. If the hamburger menu is on the right on these screens, maybe just keep it on the right. Right? Right. All right. How did you toggle between artboards in preview mode? So I can just press the left and right arrow keys to go back and forth. So we've got our light version and we've got our dark version. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is, let me go ahead and open up one more document. Let me move this over here just in case there's top secret stuff. There probably isn't, but you never know. You just never know. So the last thing I want to talk about is the new feature that was released in XD32, and that's the ability to have multiple flows on your document. So in this case, we've got a few different flows that we might want to share with different people. We've got our low fidelity right over here. We might want to use for user testing. We have our design system and presentation up here. And we have high fidelity that might be ready for development, right? So now in prototype mode, what I can do is I can go ahead and click on a home screen or an artboard, click on the home icon to the left, which you've been able to do before, but now you can go ahead and actually label these. So I can label this high fidelity. I can label this one, I can have a second flow, this will be user testing. And I can also label this one at the top, design system. And this gives you a few different benefits, right? The first benefit is you're able to, in design mode or prototype mode, you can select the flows. It's going to select all the wired up artboards within that flow. So I can just move all of them around if I need to, and I can very easily just kind of rearrange my document. So I don't have to worry about mistaken or missing certain flows or certain artboards that are part of the flow. The second thing you can do is within share mode, you can actually share individual flows with different people. So user testing, for example, I've already gone ahead and shared these, but you can create a separate link for user testing, a separate link for high fidelity flows, and a separate link for design systems. So cool new feature that was just released in XD32. But that is going to wrap it up for today. Very quick recap of what we created in this masterclass. Looks pretty fancy, doesn't it? And here's what it looks like when I uploaded it to Twitter. So a big thank you to everyone who has joined me live today. Stick around in just a few minutes. Nick and Andrew are coming up with office hours, and I believe Kyle T. Webster is coming up with a masterclass right after that. Thank you to Yasir and Jeff and Laura Ariana, Joe Hazma. I'm going to be back next week, same time, same place, same channel. Follow me on Twitter, follow me on Dribble, follow me on YouTube, all the places, and I'll see you all next time.